What in the world is the world? The question I think many of you were in a sense angling for. You were ahead of me in terms of anticipating this question. What in the world is the world? Now, when you read the New Testament, especially the epistles, you frequently encounter the little phrase, the world. So 1 John 2, verse 15, John says, do not love the world or anything in the world. Wow. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. And I could read you many other verses that reflect the world in an extremely negative way. So what is this? What's going on here? Well, it can't be referring to the planet in our solar system. The planet we actually happen to be inhabiting because God made this planet for our home. So if the world as this planet is a really bad thing, then we've got a problem. That's a contradiction with God creating it and making it good. So what does the New Testament mean when it uses the world in this very negative way? Well, to begin with, we have to clear away some misunderstandings, some that you've already begun to anticipate. The first is this: the world is not the same thing as culture. We have to get this one right. The world is not the same thing as culture. Many Christians have made this mistake. They've conflated what the Bible calls the world with culture. And when this happens, Christians begin to develop a negative attitude to all sorts of manifestations of culture. They're just afraid of culture. Culture contaminates. So we need to get into the bubble to stay uncontaminated. And what this move forgets is that God made humans to be culture makers. This is part of what it means when he gave us dominion. It's one of the ways we bear his image. Culture itself, as made by humans, is a marvelous good. And it's reflected in thousands, if not tens of thousands. I'm going to even attempt to exaggerate, I think millions of ways. We reflect culture by leaving our signature on the world. Culture is what we do to the world that nature could never do for itself. That's basically what it is. So culture is marvelous. One of the ways we reflect God. And Christians should be the first to affirm the wonder of culture. Here we are in Poland, and we're eating some Polish food. There's more than Polish food in the dining room, but I get the Polish flavor. That's a wonderful thing. There's a reflection of culture in food. So when the Bible refers to the world, clearly it's not referencing culture. It's talking about something else. So what is it? Well, here's where I'd go. The world is made up of certain cultural values that give direction to human society. The world is essentially cultural values that direct and shape human society. Now, for a human society to work, we have to bring certain values to it. And many of the values we bring are good. So think of the democratic value. You can't find democracy in nature. You don't find it in a pride of lions. It's a human idea, a value that we translate into our human societies. So the democratic value says society works well with the rule of the many rather than the rule of the one, the rule of the dictator. And the way the many rule is in our freedom to select them and to deselect them. That's the democratic value, and it's a good one. But if some cultural values are good, others are bad. We live under the shadow of the fall. And since the fall, humans together have created cultural values that are not what God intended. And those are the form of the world, as the New Testament uses that word. So in Colossians 2, verse 8, Paul refers to bad cultural values. And he does this by referring to that which depends on human tradition and the basic principle, the elemental spirits, it could even be translated, of this world rather than on Christ. So when societies construct values or basic principles that are not shaped by Christ, you have what the New Testament calls the world. So to follow the logic of the New Testament, we can define the world as being comprised of what I'm going to call super values that are set up to rival God. The world are super values set up to rival God. Now, this is exactly what Paul's talking about in a very important passage in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul says, "For though we live in the world," and that's a good thing, "we do not wage war as the world does." We're in a battle, but we don't fight like the world does. "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world." Not nuclear armaments, not drones dropping bombs. No, on the contrary, our weapons have divine power to demolish strongholds. And look where the demolition happens. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So Paul's telling us here that the world works with a set of strongholds that function in the realm of ideas, what I call super values. So he refers to arguments, he refers to thoughts. He could have used the word values. So these super values are set up, and he calls them pretensions, against the knowledge of God. Now this idea of pretensions which are set up should immediately alert us to the ancient worlds, where idols were set up in the temples of every single city. Idols set up as God substitutes. Well, the world is a set of super values set up as strongholds to rival God. Now, later on, we're going to look at the 4 big super values of our time. I'm not going to give them away yet. But let me give you one super value that I'm not going to mention as my 4, to help you understand what a super value is. Think for a moment about how we view science today. We believe science is the solution to all of our problems. That's already being lifted up as a super value. Science is the tool which can unlock the secret of everything. And that means we give it high-level value in terms of what we trust. What did we trust to get us through COVID-19? Science. It was set up. It did largely a good job, probably. Who knows? We'll see what the data says. But that's an example of a super value. So it's the super values of our times that constitute the world, as the New Testament uses this phrase. And these pose danger for the life of the church. And if we allow ourselves to be shaped by them rather than demolishing them, we're going to become worldly. Now, although there's different kinds of super values, as we'll see in a moment, all of them work the same way. They share the following 3 characteristics. Let me move through them quickly. These 3 characteristics are true of all super values. First, super values are spiritually weighted. Paul's driving at this when he says they're set up against the knowledge of God. So super values function as a God replacement. And as a God replacement, society gives them spiritual value. We give super values the kind of trust that functions as a kind of religion almost. And that's why the church has to demolish them, because it's a false trust. That's why they're dangerous. The second characteristic of a super value is that they're socially shared. For a super value to work, everyone in a society has to buy into it. So super values are lifted up, whatever they are, and that binds a society together. It gives cohesion to the group. It's like the gods of the ancient world. You go to Athens. Athens is named after Athena, the god of practical reason and many other things. This is a powerful goddess. Everyone in Athens believes in Athena. She binds them together. It's the same with super values. And that's what gives these the quality of super, something which is lifted up. The majority buy in and it binds them. The third characteristic is that super values are embedded everywhere in culture. And that's why Paul wasn't exaggerating when he uses the language of strongholds. And part of the way super values become a stronghold is that they bed themselves into cultural life in very tangible ways. Now that's interesting because a value is nothing in and of itself. It's just an idea. You can't see a value. But values have lots of ways of becoming concretized and real in culture. Now, one of the ways this happens is in advertising. We could spend a whole afternoon looking at adverts to unpick super values. Now, one of the super values, we are going to look at this one later, one of the super values of our time is hedonism, which means life is for your sensual pleasure. That's what life is all about. And you wouldn't believe how many things are marketed under the hedonistic super value. I would say almost everything. Yogurt. How do you market yogurt? With sex. Pay attention to the next yogurt advert you see. That's how it's being peddled. The hedonism cultural value sells yogurt. I love yogurt, but what does yogurt and sex have to do with each other? Not much, except it appeals to the super value. Now, because of how super values work, there are no safe places for believers. The world functions like a virus. It really is the pandemic we're facing. And that means Christians are under constant threat of contamination by the world because of these characteristics, because of how they work. It's interesting, in COVID, we were told to stay home to stay safe. You can't stay safe if you're in your home from super values. Why? Because most of your homes have at least 10 screens in them. 10 screens. And the super values just pour through your screens, your smart screens, your computer monitors, your TVs. You're not safe in your home. That's the point. We're under constant threat. So how do we keep ourselves from being contaminated? Well, once again, Jack shows the way. C.S. Lewis. Now, Jesus shows the way, but Jack did a very good job of summarizing the best of Jesus. Lewis says this: you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness. We need the strongest spell. And what's the strongest spell? Well, back in 2 Corinthians 10, Paul told us, he said, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought, including how we imagine things, to make it obedient to Christ. The strongest spell we're in need of is the mind of Jesus, letting his word, his outlook, shape how we think, how we imagine. That's our vaccine against being worldly. So why did the New Testament writers, including Jesus, who didn't write any part of the New Testament, but he uses the idea of the world, why did they choose that terminology when it could potentially be so confusing? I'd make the problem even worse for you. Why did they choose the phrase "the flesh"?
Oh yes, that's the other one.
Yes, so because that also is rather problematic. When many Christians have done this, starting with Augustine a little bit, my hero, but here I think he went a bit wrong, where your body is contaminated, polluted, and the source of the problem. I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't choose it. But it's interesting that they all use similar terminology across different books. And I think it's just up to us to do the work. And what we have to do is make sure our hermeneutic, our interpretation, lines up with a creation theology. Christians who go wrong here usually have a very defective creation theology. And I think, what we're dealing with here is metaphor. And we use the world in a similar way all the time. And in fact, Christians constantly use the world as culture. Oh, the world out there. I think they're referring to culture. It's interesting, Churchill said it was the best of two evils. It's the better way, not the perfect way. And I actually don't think Israel at its best functioned as a democracy. It was a covenantal nation. But I would far prefer to have democracy than tyranny. I think the problem comes is when we raise that value up and say, if we democratize the world, it's going to become a better place. It's a little bit of George Bush's experiment. We'll export democracy to the whole world. And guess what? The Middle East in no time will become a haven. It'll become a paradise. It didn't quite happen. Democracy Someone said democracy takes 1,000 years to establish in a nation. People like Mussolini can take it away from a country like Italy very, very quickly. And it's true of other nations too. Yeah, good point. It's not perfect. So my point that super values are socially shared, how far can we affirm this sharing given that we're in a post-truth society, given that we're rather fragmented? How does it work in terms of the sharing? And I would say in terms of super values, the digital age translates the narratives of all the super values. So someone from London and someone from New York are exposed to very similar things, even if one has a different accent from the other. So I think the digital age has allowed for a pluralism that becomes truly global in a way we've never seen before. There's more potential for the sharing than there ever has been in other times, which is why I think the world today is a global phenomenon. It's hitting the southern hemisphere. We'll see this, the four I actually mentioned, very much now going into the southern hemisphere. We've been in the super values I'm going to mention for a long time, but they're going south quickly because of the internet.